Chapter 6, Section 2, Creating a Government, Writing the U.S. Constitution. The Articles of Confederation had a few major flaws that kept the United States from growing stronger. The federal government was too weak, and state legislatures were too strong, and the inability to pay debts from the war was hurting national credit. In September of 1786, the Annapolis Convention was held, and 5 states met to discuss disputes over trade rights surrounding the Potomac River and territorial rights in New York and Vermont, but no official business was completed. Alexander Hamilton asked Congress to allow state delegates to meet in 1787, which launched the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention of 1787. When the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, there were 55 delegates from 12 states. All 55 of the delegates were white men. Rhode Island didn't send delegates because they feared a strong central government. The purpose of the convention was to amend the Articles of Confederation, though some people had other ideas, like creating a new government. Many politicians, like Patrick Henry and John Hancock, from the Revolution, feared a strong central government and did not attend the convention. Decisions on the structure of a unified government. Delegates at the convention presented 2 plans for a new government. The Virginia Plan was presented by Edmund Randolph and James Madison. The Virginia Plan created a system of federalism where both national and state governments held real power, but in separate spheres. It called for a Congress with 2 houses, a central government strong enough to levy taxes, the authority to control interstate commerce, and to veto state laws. It also had a national executive position, as well as creating a national court system. The Virginia Plan was perceived to give more authority to larger states like Virginia because they would have more elected representatives in government. The New Jersey Plan was presented by William Patterson and called for one House legislature with the same number of representatives from each state. The New Jersey Plan protected the smaller states. The Connecticut Plan, also known as the Connecticut Compromise or Great Compromise, was presented by Roger Sherman. It called for a 2-house legislature. One house would determine the number of representatives by the state's population. The other house would have equal representation for all states. This would become the basis for the new government. The Electoral College was presented by James Madison, who didn't trust the common man. The number of electors, or people who would ultimately determine the election, was the number of senators and representatives from each state. The popular vote in each state would determine the electors that would cast their vote in each state. If no presidential candidate received a majority of the electoral votes, the election would be determined by the House of Representatives. The effects of slavery on a unified government. In order for states to ratify the new Constitution, they had to agree upon how to count slaves toward the population to determine the number of representatives in Congress and the number of electors in the Electoral College, as well as for tax purposes. Founding fathers like James Madison, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson all owned slaves and were okay with the contradiction of principles because they viewed slaves as property, not people. They agreed to the 3/5 compromise, where a slave would equal 3/5 of a person for tax purposes and representation in government. They also agreed that the importation of slaves would be illegal starting in 1808, but kept a clause in the Constitution that stated the Constitution couldn't limit internal slave trade. They also agreed to the Fugitive Slave Clause, which called for the extradition of runaway slaves who were captured. Debating and adopting the Constitution. John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton were leading Federalists who wrote the Federalist Papers to convince the public the Constitution was the best option. Federalists addressed issues of representation, standing army, and commerce or credit. They had clear documents and a clear argument for their side. They stressed the importance of a strong federal government. Anti-Federalists were concerned that the new Constitution resembled the British monarchy that they had just fought to get away from, and that the Constitution would trample the rights of sovereign states and individual citizens. Ratification. The next step was voting for ratification of the new Constitution. Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut ratified right away. Massachusetts agreed to ratify under the condition that a Bill of Rights to protect the rights and freedoms of individual citizens was added to the Constitution. South Carolina agreed to ratify under the condition that the states would retain rights not specifically given to the federal government. Virginia ratified under the condition that a Bill of Rights was added, just like Massachusetts. New Hampshire then ratified to make 9 states, the minimum required to make the Constitution the new government. Please pause your video and take a few minutes to answer the 3 review questions from Section 2.